Hi, everyone. Welcome to another interview. I am so excited about today's guest. Paolina Milana is the author of The S Word and Committed, a memoir of madness in the family. Welcome, Paulina.
Thank you so much. I am super excited to be talking with you today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I related to so many parts of your story. First of all, our mums suffer from schizophrenia. Both our parents immigrated to a new country. We both took on the role of Piccola Mamma. Our fathers passed away from massive heart attacks, and I too contemplated ending it all at one point. So I want to start by talking about your role as Piccola Mamma, which is little mother. That's the nickname your father gave you. What was it like to step into that caregiving role at such a young age?
Mm. Well, first off, I want to say again, it is as if I am talking to a soul that was split at birth from me. So many similarities. And it is true, one cannot know what this is all about unless you walk in these shoes. I mean, to be quite frank, right? And the next best thing is to share the stories and help people understand if they can. For me, the whole Piccola Mamma, and maybe you can relate, it's complicated because on the one hand, as a child, becoming Piccola Mamma, being given that kind of responsibility, there's power in that as a child, right? You feel really important. You feel as if you're contributing. You're not just a little tiny person who doesn't have a voice, right? You have taken on this huge responsibility. On the flip side of that, and you don't possibly realize this as a child, at least when you're starting out, when you become Piccola Mamma or you're dubbed Piccola Mamma, suddenly your entire childhood is wiped out. And it's interesting because I think everyone can understand when you're a kid, you're trying to grow up so fast, right? So fast. You just want to be a kid. You want to do the things adults do. Now, as an adult, I would give anything to have, a little nap every afternoon and, juice boxes and just play all day. But as a child, you don't realize what you're giving up. So Piccola Mamma, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's a power play, and on the other hand, it is very much a loss of innocence, a time when, unbeknownst to you, you are giving up your innocence and your freedom and your ability to play and figure things out for yourself, and be selfish because that's what the life of a child really should be, right? It's all about you in exchange for suddenly becoming a caregiver and becoming someone who puts other people's needs well ahead of her own. And the more that that continues, the more you do that to your own detriment.
Right. And also, you were consigliere to your dad.
Yeah. Yeah, talk about, you know what? My father's favorite movie was The Godfather, and I love it too, right? But the consigliere is indeed the counselor, right? The consultant. And because my parents, and you'll appreciate this too, being immigrants, English not first language, not my first language either, somebody had to translate things. Somebody had to explain what was going on, right?
Right.
And for me, I really think that that's kind of how my writing just really accelerated, because having to write letters, and whether they were tardy notes for school, my own tardy notes, right? Or real letters on why we couldn't pay a bill, real letters on the issues with my mom, and how to explain that away, insurance letters. You do become someone who just takes on the role of an adult with having to have a knowledge that should be well beyond your years. And what's even more challenging, I think, is having taken on that role, and just to lay it on the line here, not only was I primary caregiver to my mom, who was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, but also my younger sister, also diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. So here I was as a child for my mother, someone who, because of my age, was really kind of dismissed, right? Didn't really matter what I said. I needed to, as my father used to say, ci deve fare vedere I denti, which means you got to show them your teeth. When you are not viewed as the adult, as even though you're taking on those responsibilities, there's an added level of problem associated because even if you do know the answers or do know what they're asking for, they don't view you as a credible source for those things, right? So you're constantly struggling on several different levels.
I'm just amazed in getting ready for this interview. I went back and reread Committed, but then I saw that it was a continuation of the S word. So I got it. And it gave me a whole different view of your life. There was so much going on. You had the chaos happening at home.
Mhm.
Obviously, your mum's schizophrenia and your sister, Vinny, nobody really knew what was happening. And because of just the severity of what was happening with your mum,
Mhm.
Vinny kind of just kept getting put on the
Passed on.
sideline.
Yeah.
Obviously, you were going through the normal teenage things, which was a lot of self-doubt, going to school. You kept up excellent grades despite little to no sleep.
Only
And
because, I mean, to be quite frank, those grades, they were one thing that I knew I could control. You were in charge, and it was yet another thing that showed my superiority, if we can say, among others, right? I was always trying to prove the fact that I was worthy. And that was just one more way to do it. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
and that's fine. And also, you were working, and I started working at a young age too.
It's
And so
crazy. It's another common thing of a child, right? I want to make my own money, but to actually like do it, like I forged my birth certificate at the age of 13, pretending, yeah, I mean, so that I could get a job because we needed the money. But
right.
that then unfolded into its own problems. So yeah, I was dealing with a lot.
And also, what was difficult for me to read was what happened with Gunnar.
Yeah,
That absolutely broke my heart because you were so young,
yeah.
and it was a really abuse of power. You were a kid,
I
he was
was a
an
kid.
adult. He was probably around my age. I'm 45. I think he was
Yeah.
40.
He had just turned 40. I had just turned 14. I think one thing to learn, or at least one thing I have learned, is nothing's black and white. It just isn't. And when you are 13, 14, you are coming into your own. Like there's a big period of sexual awareness, right? Of you turning from a child into a young woman. And in my household, first off, being Sicilian, my mother grew up in a very oppressed family. Any kind of hint of sexual anything, you were a bad, bad girl. On the one hand, my mom, her mental illness had her focusing on me as the devil's spawn, kind of the girl who was promiscuous. And I wasn't any of those things. I wasn't. I was someone who really was joyful and animated and expressive, and she was worried. Then to have myself be infatuated with
Right.
a police officer
Yeah.
who, I worked at a donut shop. He was by all rights given the right to watch over me by my dad, who couldn't be there when I worked nights, and he took advantage. And yet, the reason it's so complicated is because he was the adult, he took advantage, but until the moment when he crosses a line, I'm all in. And it's, it's hard. It's hard to come to terms with yourself. Part of even the whole writing is an exercise. When I wrote the S word, it took me 10 years. It started out as a book where I was pointing all fingers on all the adults, all the authority figures who had screwed me over. And it turned out after 10 years to be a book about forgiveness. Not only forgiveness for them, but forgiveness for myself, because I I carried that shame. I mean, if you really want to look at it, everything that I had done, I basically proved my mom right that I was evil and bad and promiscuous and right. And really, I wasn't. But you don't know that when you're a kid, right? And especially when your heart is involved. And granted, he was a hell of a lot older, but I had the hots for this guy. I mean, I'll just say it, right? The onus was on him, not me, but it takes a long time for any of us to let ourselves off the hook. Know what I mean?
Yeah,
Especially as women in this society. So, yeah, it was a challenging childhood.
it was. When you're a teenager, the age difference matters too.
Hmm.
And the age when you met him, just to have somebody pay that kind of attention to you,
Hmm.
even if it had have been, say, your older brother's friend paying attention to you, it's like, oh, you know.
Yeah.
But to have an adult and a police officer pay that kind of attention to you, I could definitely see the infatuation,
Hmm.
but that doesn't say, okay, it justifies what he
Right.
did cross the line because you were a child. You
Yeah.
were a kid. With everything that was happening, and our stories are so layered, there's so much going on. What do you think helped you through those difficult years? For me, if I can just jump in a bit,
Yeah.
I felt like life was never going to get better. That I couldn't have a boyfriend, that life just because it had been a sustained level of just chaos and I hated everything about my life. I ended up hating myself. I thought nothing's ever going to get better. I just would rather die. And
Hmm.
so when you're a teenager and most of your life has been in this sort of dynamic, it's hard to see beyond what's immediately in front of
Right.
you. So
Yeah.
what what do you think helped you get through?
First off, I'm sorry that you had to experience all of that and get to the point where you thought there was nothing worth living for. I share that feeling, but for me, it happened farther down the line when I was left alone. My father had died, and he was my rock. And I was left caring for both my mom and my sister in silence. Like no one outside knew, right? I was still excelling at work, but I was killing myself. I was suffocation. Silence suffocates. I always say that. And I was living this life of obligation in silence. Before that, as a child, I liken this analogy, if you put a frog in a pot of water, they'll swim around, right? They don't know what's going on. But you turn up the heat, they'll still swim around until they realize it's so hot they're being cooked to death, right? When it started out with me as a child, it's your life. You don't know anything different, right? So you're going along, you see outside and you're like, wait a minute, they don't do that, or wait a minute, this isn't normal, right? And you start to kind of get those inklings of something's off here, right? But I had a dad who, and I'm not going to say that he was perfect. There's a scene in the S Word when my dad literally nearly killed me. I don't mean to laugh about it, but when looking back, I'm just sort of like, holy moly, had he gone just a little bit more, I would be dead. We'd be one of those families, you know what I mean, where the parent is accused of killing a child. And ironically, it was my mother who saved me at
Right.
that point, right? But aside from that, he had a way of, he was struggling. He had to bring in the dollars, right? Put the food on the table, etc. He did his best with my mom. I obviously helped, like you were saying, the consigliere, the language barriers, but he brought with him this joy of life. Everything from cooking. He played the mandolin beautifully, right? He sang. I remember times we would walk outside especially during the fall, and he'd like pick up a leaf of different colors and just marvel at it, right? He had an ever evolving love and wonder for life. One of his favorite lines was to say, never you know, right? And that just kind of got us, from this moment to this moment to this moment. I think too at that time, I I just made up stories. I would see something in the road, and I don't know if it was my imagination or I really believed it, but I remember we were driving along, and I saw something in the road, and I was like, uh, Daddy, you got to turn around. Papa, you have to turn the car around. And he was like, why? What happened? And I'm like, there was a giant snake in the road. And he's like, no, there's not a snake in it. And yes, I saw him. And it turned out it was like a tailpipe, right?
Oh,
He did
okay.
turn around, right? So I think my father played a big role in it, my imagination, my writing, being able to, write little stories. And again, the school, having something that I would be given a task, I would accomplish it. I would accomplish it knowing that I would get praise, right? Those things had me believing that this wasn't it for me. Somehow, some way in my core, I believed that until I no longer did.
Mm.
And that's what gets dangerous because anything can change on a dime. Tomorrow morning, you and I could wake up and we could find out that we won the lottery. You and I, tomorrow morning, God forbid, maybe we don't wake up, right? I mean, anything can change. There's a line, and I don't know who said it, that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And that is so true, right? And I look back now, if I had done what I had mapped out and was literally on the precipice of doing it, I would have missed out on an incredible life. I'm sure you feel the same way. An incredible life, right? So never, ever, ever give up. Never. As a matter of fact, the more the stuff that comes your way, the more you just use it as stepping stones instead of stumbling blocks, right? I have it somewhere here. Somebody once gave me one of those Hallmark cards, and on the front it said something like, Rocky Road is either a stumbling path or one heck of a sweet ice cream, right? It's how you perceive it. So, how you define it. To be quite frank, I had three siblings, right? My younger sister, who was diagnosed with mental illness, and she passed away. My older sister and older brother. My older brother and I were very, very close growing up, and he had a wicked sense of humor. And I think the more you can surround yourself with people who can see the humor, can make light of what's going on, even if in its darkest moments, that will take you far.
Yeah, that just brought to mind with my brother, we would sometimes like just bizarre things that my mum would say, and he would bring it up, and we would look at each other and go, my God, that's just nuts, and laugh.
Right.
But you would never talk about these things with
No,
anybody else, right? Yeah.
exactly.